2022. So I think it's not too late to say Happy New Year. Well, previously we have invited leading scholars from all over the world to communicate about the key topics in public administration. For example, dialogues on health governance or governmental innovation in and post-pandemic. These are very important questions in public administration. And today, the topic is environment governance, which is also quite relevant to all of us, in particular in the context of climate change. So I'm very much looking forward to today's speech. But before we start, let me invite Professor Eileen Lu of City University of New York and Professor Weiwen Zhang of Zhejiang University to give welcome speeches. Professor Eileen Lu is our section chair of SCPA, and Professor Zhang is the Associate Dean of School of Public Affairs. They jointly organized this series. So Professor Lu.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. Hello, everyone. My name is Eileen Lu. I am a professor director of public policy and administration at John Jay College of City University of New York. I also is the editor-in-chief for the International Journal of Public Administration. This year, I happen to be, this is actually my last year as the elected chair of the section on Chinese public administration of ASPA. So the new election is running, and I hope anyone who is hearing this message, if you're interested, please nominate yourself to be the chair of the section, okay? I can't believe this is already the fifth edition, the fifth time that we have this dialogue. And I really wanted to thank my colleague from Zhejiang University, Dean Zhang, to collaborate with us on this initiative. Although Dean Zhang and I are world apart, I feel like our organizations share the same mission of building a better, stronger, and a more connected community of scholars. If you like the activity that we are providing throughout the year, so please feel free to join us. And our section staff, Hanjing, will be sending out information in the chat. I also would like to extend my sincere welcome to our distinguished guests tonight or this morning, wherever you are. Thank you for taking your time out of the busy schedule to share your insights. In this increasingly divided world, we hope that our love for this field and our commitment to public administration can bond us together. I look forward to the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lu. Professor Zhang, could you please give your also opening speech?
Okay, thanks, Dr. Yu and Elaine. So dear speakers, colleagues, and friends, good morning, good evening. Thank you from different parts of the world to participate in Sino-US Scholar Dialogue Series on Public Administration. On behalf of School of Public Affairs, Zhejiang University, I would like to extend my warmest welcome and sincere thanks to all the guests and participants. It's great to meet you here. So as Elaine and Lu just mentioned, this is the fifth dialogue jointly held by the section on Chinese public administration of ASPA and our school. In the past 4 dialogues, our topic covered the public physical issue, emerging technologies, health policy, government innovation. So today we will talk environmental governance. I believe this topic will be interesting and meaningful. So next, please allow me to take a few minutes to introduce our university and school. Located in Hangzhou, one of China's most picturesque cities, Zhejiang University is one of China's top higher education institutions, as well as one of its oldest. Founded in 2005, as School of Public Affairs insists on being a leading public administration school and a pioneer in digital governance in China. Adhering to the model of world affairs as responsibility and choose as faith SPA is committed to excellence in teaching, learning, and research, and to nurturing leaders. So currently we have more than 120 faculty members and over 3,000 degree-seeking students. Besides, we provide 2 English taught master programs. MPA program has been accredited by NASPA. So finally, special thanks to our partner, especially to Elaine, who with us for several months and give us great support during this special period. We believe that we would get together in person in Hangzhou very soon. So enjoy this academic feast.
Thank you, Professor John. Now I will extend a warm welcome to all our speakers today. We have 4 speakers. They will share with us their research and opinion on different aspects of environment governance. Each of them will give a speech, 20 to 25 minutes, and then we also have a discussant, Professor Wu Yang from Zhejiang University. If our audience have questions or comments, you're welcome to type them in the chat box. We will catch them in the Q&A section in the end. Now, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Jonah Busch. Jonah is a climate economist at Conservation International. He's the author of more than 35 scientific papers, and also the co-author of the book, Why Forests, Why Now? The Science, Economics, and Politics of Tropical Forests and Climate Change. Dr. Busch has advised on the design of climate and forest finance mechanism for numerous government and international organizations. And very important to note that from 2017 to 2016 to 2017, Jonah was a visiting scholar at Zhejiang University. So this event is really a very good follow-up of the collaboration. Jonah today will share with us his research on global ecological fiscal transfer, and I was very honored to be part of the research. So Jonah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lausha. Is everyone able to see the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. 早上好，新年快乐。我的中文不太好，所以我今天要说英语。Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. My Chinese is not very good, so I'll be speaking in English today. I'm very happy to participate today in the 5th workshop of the Sino-US Scholar Dialogue Series on Public Administration. Thank you, Professor Yu, for the invitation. And this is special for me personally because, as Professor Yu mentioned, my wife and I lived in Hangzhou from 2016 to 2017. She was working at Alibaba, and I was a visiting scholar at Jeddah in the lab of Professor Yang, who will be the discussant today. And if you can see my background image, this is from a reservoir near Hangzhou. So I can attest that, as Zhang Lausha said, Hangzhou is a very beautiful city. My talk today is a global review of ecological fiscal transfers. Ecological fiscal transfers are one type of financial instrument that national governments can use to encourage environmental action by provincial and local governments. So this is especially relevant for climate change. I'm trying to figure out how to advance. Okay. So this talk is based on a paper that was published last year in Nature Sustainability that was written by 23 researchers from 15 countries. We came together for a 4-day online workshop to conduct a global review of ecological fiscal transfers. And Professor Yu is one of the co-authors, as we mentioned, and you'll also see there Professor Wang Xiaoxi and Joe Kutzen, who were very helpful in writing this paper. So first, the definition. Ecological fiscal transfers, or EFT for short, transfer public revenue between governments within a country based on ecological indicators. So ecological fiscal transfers could be vertical or horizontal. Vertical meaning a transfer from a higher level government to a lower level government, or horizontal meaning a transfer between governments at the same level within a country. They may be either based on nature conservation, such as the amount of land conserved within a national park, or pollution abatement, meaning the reduction of air pollution or water pollution. And ecological fiscal transfers could be general purpose or specific purpose. General purpose, meaning that the funds are transferred to the general accounts, the general budgets of a subnational government, where they could be spent on anything, or specific purpose, meaning that they are within, they're earmarked for just only for one environmental purpose. And a large part of the attraction of ecological fiscal transfers relative to other policies or financial instruments is that they have the potential to be fiscally neutral, meaning that they can be achieved by reformulating existing revenue flows between governments rather than requiring a parliament or an agency to raise and spend new revenue. So what you can see here is a map of the world of all of the countries where ecological fiscal transfers are existing or are emerging or have been proposed. And I'll be talking today mostly about the 5 countries where ecological fiscal transfers are well established. So really diving deep into examples from Brazil, Portugal, France, China, and India. I won't be talking as much, but you could find in the paper examples of emerging ecological fiscal transfers in Uganda, Mongolia, and Indonesia, or proposals in Germany, Poland, Ukraine, the European Union, and the Australian state of Queensland. So I'll begin by describing the ecological fiscal transfers in Brazil. So in Brazil, ever since 1922, states have been authorized to collect value-added tax. Then beginning in the 1988 reformed constitution, states were able to come up with a formula for how a fraction of the value-added tax that they collect is returned to the municipalities within the state. So for 6.75% of the tax revenue that states collect through value-added tax, they get to set the formula for how that money is devolved to municipalities. Now, at the same time, in the 1980s, Brazil, the national government of Brazil created quite a large amount of national water and biodiversity protection areas. So because they were protecting biodiversity and water, they had national or regional public benefits, even global public benefits. But at the same time, they imposed costs on the local governments, the local landowners and the local governments where these protection areas were put in place. Landowners were restricted in what they could do with land, and municipalities therefore had a smaller tax base. So in order to compensate municipalities for lost tax revenue, the state of Paraná added indicators for the amount of municipal area within one of these protected areas within this formula for devolving tax revenue. So for the first time, a municipality that had more land protected would receive more in tax revenue transfer. And this proved to be quite a popular concept. By 2020, the ecological fiscal transfers had spread to 18 of Brazil's 27 states. And because each state gets to decide on the formula, they had quite a variety in what they included as environmental indicators. So as you see here, some included protected areas, indigenous land, sanitation, forest area, and so on. The share of the transfer that can be considered ecological varies considerably between states. In the state of Sao Paulo, only 1% of the transfer. In the state of Acre, 20% of the transfer. And by 2017, almost $9 billion had been transferred from states to municipal governments on the basis of these environmental indicators. Researchers have been trying to conclude from this what the benefits or what the effects of such policy, such transfers have been. It was found that as a result of the ecological fiscal transfer, municipalities tripled the amount of protected areas that they put in place and shortened the time of putting protected areas in place. However, some of these may have been parks on paper only, including in the case of one municipality that said that the entire municipality, 100%, was now a protected area, albeit a completely unmanaged one. So this is Brazil. Soon after that, Portugal put in place ecological fiscal transfers. So in 1992, the European Union founded the EU, the Natura 2000 network, which again put in place land restrictions within countries that had biodiversity or other high environmental values to the benefit of everyone in Europe, but imposed restrictions on local land use. In 2007, Portugal amended its local finances law, which governed how funds are transferred from the national to the local governments. And inspired by Brazil, Portugal created national to local ecological fiscal transfers. Interestingly, they did so without ever consulting with the local governments. They just went ahead and did it. And so for 7 years, mayors, the elected leaders of these governments, didn't actually know how much money they were getting, or even that they were getting money for protecting land. Finally, they did have a consultation, so they learned that. And over the years 2008 to 2020, about $1 billion were transferred through this ecological fiscal transfer, amounting to around 2.5% of the total transfer to local governments. Researchers concluded, similar to in Brazil, that ecological fiscal transfers may have been responsible for an increase in regional and local protected areas. France has, for several decades, had something called Dotation Globale de Fonctionnement, which redistributes funds from central government to local departments and municipalities. Starting in 2007, they added 2 ecological indicators to the formula governing these transfers to local governments. One is the area within the core of a national park. The other is area within a marine park. This is a very small ecological fiscal transfer. Only around 150 of France's 35,000 municipalities have received funding and are only around $4 million per year. But this is poised to expand considerably, as in 2019, a third ecological indicator was added. Again, land within these Natura 2000 sites. So the number of eligible municipalities increased about 7 or 8-fold. The fourth country with ecological fiscal transfers is China, which most of you know better than I will, so I won't spend too much time on China. But in 2010, the major function-oriented zoning scheme categorized land into 4 categories of allowed development, and from development highly encouraged to development restricted or prohibited. And in the municipalities where the development is restricted, there were transfers to the local governments based on ecological indicators. And the allocation formula includes a lot of indicators, including biological richness, vegetation coverage, water network density, and so forth. Interestingly, the top performing local governments receive bonuses, and the bottom performers are levied with fines. And the environmental indicators amount to about 1% of the transfers from central government to local governments. By 2020, ecological fiscal transfers had grown to around $11 billion per year, so quite a bit larger than the other countries. Studies by researchers have found that ecological fiscal transfers in China have reduced pollution, air and water pollution, but have not yet increased ecological land use. And the final country I'll talk about is India. In India, from shortly after independence until today, there's an independent government body called the Finance Commission, which decides on how tax revenue is distributed from the union government, the national government, to the state governments. So every 5 years, they convene to decide on what the formula will be. And in 2015, the 14th of these finance commissions, for the first time, included forest area as one of the indicators, alongside population and poverty and other indicators. And this was 7.5% of the tax revenue collected nationally and distributed to states. They mentioned 2 motivations: compensating states for fiscal disability, meaning that if there's forests in an area, they can't have agriculture, and therefore states can't raise taxes from that. And they also recognize that forests have huge ecological benefits, including for the climate. So India's International Climate Pledge mentioned the ecological fiscal transfer as a finance mechanism to support the country's forest and climate goals. Between 2015 and 2020, around $37 billion was transferred to states, averaging to around $170 to $300 per hectare of forest per year. Some of my co-authors and I have tried to figure out what the effect of the ecological fiscal transfers have been on forest cover and state forest budgets. And mostly what we found is that there hasn't yet been much of an effect. That may be changing soon, as several forest states have recently passed very notable forest policies, perhaps as a result of this finance mechanism. And in 2020, the 15th Finance Commission increased the amount of the transfer that is indexed to forests from 7.5% of the total transfer to 10% of the total transfer. indicating how important this fiscal transfer is. Okay, so what you can see here is how rapidly ecological fiscal transfers have grown since their inception in the state of Paraná in 1992. And so in 2007, only about $1/3 of $1 billion US per year was transferred through ecological fiscal transfers. But as of 2020, that had grown all the way up to $23 billion per year. And probably this will continue to grow. If France has expanded, India has expanded its transfers, and then several other countries are joining in as well. So recently, after we published the paper, both Indonesia and Malaysia have put in place ecological fiscal transfers too. So this is still quite a growing mechanism worldwide. Even so, ecological fiscal transfers have considerable scope to. How am I doing on time? Okay, I think I'm close, perhaps. Okay. So ecological fiscal transfers have considerable room to grow. They comprise only 1/2 of 1% of all of the funding that is transferred from national governments to subnational governments. So greening, even a small fraction of intergovernmental fiscal transfers could grow ecological fiscal transfers considerably. So just to conclude then, the key points, ecological fiscal transfers have been established in 5 countries. They're emerging or have proposed in 10 more. Actually, now this is 7 countries they've been established. They've grown very rapidly in the past decade. They can compensate subnational governments for the costs of conserving ecosystems or reducing pollution. And in principle, they can also incentivize greater levels of conservation and pollution abatement. They've had a variety of good effects already, and they can be established in a fiscally neutral way by greening existing intergovernmental transfers rather than requiring the approval of new additional annual budget outlays. And the 23 billion per year that's transferred through ecological fiscal transfers is still only about 0.5% of the total transfers through intergovernmental fiscal transfers every year. And so there's considerable room to grow. So Xian, thank you very much. And I look forward to the presentations from the other speakers today as well, and questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonah, for giving us this really nice overview of the global ecological fiscal transfer. It shows a green picture of the world. Well, now let's turn our attention from the global to national to China specific. I would like to invite our second speaker, Professor Rong Tan. He's an Associate Dean of School of Public Affairs, Zhejiang University. He's our colleague, and he's a leading scientist on natural resource management and land economics, and has conducted numerous fieldwork on relevant topics. Today, he will give us a speech titled Marketizing, Linking, and Transforming the Value of Ecological Products in China. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tan.
Thanks, Dr. Yu. Yes, it's also my glad to be invited to present the recent research from our group. It's to valuing the ecological versus values, but it's from the recently perspective from the local government. They did a lot of experiment at try to try to innovate the policies that can realize the values. But I need to share my screen. Could Professor Busch to
Yuna, I think we need to stop with screen sharing.
Thanks.
Maybe
I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing.
It's already done.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Good day, dear colleagues and friends. My topic today is related to the value of ecological services and how to evaluate the services and make the individuals willing to contribute to the protection has been a complex problem for a long time. The direct reason for this problem is that the ecosystem services is a public good, and it is difficult to enter into the process of market exchange. So the individuals are unwilling to contribute. But in fact, from the recent opinion from our society, I mean, here in the Chinese society, we gradually recognize the fundamental reason for this problem lies in the value systems and also the corresponding institutional system. So that means what kind of the value system is there will lead to the related behaviors. Let me read example. A market system has established a value system that maximizing the individual interests. So the market will not accept any values with external effect, even if the importance of those services is vital to people, such as air. So gradually we recognize this, and then we try to reform, we try to reshape these value systems, at least from the scientific perspective. So my topic today is try to discuss this topic that has emerged in China's practice in recent years. We called it the value of the ecosystem products. I will first to introduce the background a little bit and then show some practical research of the practice at the local level. And then I will discuss the value issues behind those valuing attempts. Okay, here is some of the background. Since the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China was held, the construction of the ecological civilization has entered a new stage. China has re-established the national functional departments, such as the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Ministry
Professor
of...
Tan, I'm sorry to interrupt. We cannot see your slides. It's still the title page.
What about now?
No, not yet. Maybe you can stop sharing and start sharing again. Oh, now it's good.
Is this okay?
Yes.
Because I will not expand it. Okay, let me just use this smaller screen. It's, as I mentioned, the central government tried to re-establish the functional departments, and they tried to reform the national governance systems for natural resources. Firstly, they tried to exercise the ownership of natural resources in a unified manner, and also the responsibility of protecting and restoring the ecosystem, and also including the supervision and administrative law enforcement and so on. So they try to put all of this ownership and responsibility at the central level. It can be seen that the institutional reform at this level reflects that the China want to enter into a new stage to try to keep the balance between the development and also the protection. The government attaches more important things or importance to the quality of the economic growth, and also they try to commit itself to resources conservation and also the environmental protection. For example, President Xi Jinping has posed that in Chinese it's called the two mountains concept, but in English it means the lucid waters and the large mountains are invaluable assets. The implication of this concept is that the Chinese development should pay more attention to the value of the ecosystem as a whole, and rather than its economic values. And we think this proposition makes the realizing the ecosystem products value a very hot topic in recent China. So for the things like the resource protection and maintenance, and also the ecological restoration has been the government's responsibility for a long time. And however, a very drawback of this research is that the governments, they have a very high financial pressure, and also the institutional costs are relatively very high. And so this kind of research does not really achieve the efficiency and the equity. And for example, the principle of the polluter pays and also the protector benefits, this kind of principle has not been implemented quite well. So they are both concerns and also the reasons for the information asymmetry and also the transaction costs behind. And thus, this recent years, from the government to the society, it is hoped that whether we could or there should be a market mechanism that can be realized or can be established to support the supply of the ecosystem products, and because it can either reduce the financial pressure, and also it can also conducive to the improving the efficiency and the equity of the supply. But we know that this goal does not seem so easy. So before I move in deep into this topic, I must introduce some new concept from the Chinese side. So the ecosystem product, I think this is a new concept. It is rarely seen in English literature before 2020. I know that the ecological services is often said, but the word is appeared in Chinese literature since 2010. But however, this concept is still controversial in the Chinese-speaking world. From my personal understanding, it means this ecosystem product is part of the ecological services used for the human production process. So the scope of these products, it's less than the scope of ecological services. And we now have a gradually common understanding on this concept is that these products include the ecological material products, regulating services, and cultural services that the human can obtain from the ecosystem. For this definition, ecosystem products can be divided into three categories. So the material, the regulating, and also the culture. The material means such as agriculture products, and the regulating like the carbon sequestration, water conservation, and the culture means the tourism like that. So let me come back to the previous question. And so how can individual and markets actors be motivated to supply or participate in exchanging ecosystem products? Obviously, there is almost no problem with the material one, because such products can establish property rights, especially those can be granted to the individuals. And also the cultural rights are also not a big problem, because such as tourism and healthcare, they need to rely on natural resources, and the space and the location where those natural resources are located can be documented, and can also be provided to have this property rights. So the biggest concern should be the regulated services, because those products are invisible and intangible. It is challenging from guarantee the property rights. So from the currently published the accounting results of the government, for example, the GEP, the gross ecosystem products, the general proportion of the regulating services normally exceeds 70% or even higher. So the problem is mainly in the value of this segment. So they are quite challenging to enter into the market. And this leads to the core issue that I want to discuss today. In practice, finding a realization mechanism for regulating services means that the value has not entered into the market. The realization of the value here, it means to expect to be measured by money. But my point is that it seems a matter of the market. It is it cannot treat externalities per se. So it is essentially difficult to achieve this goal. And further on, from recent opinions, I mean, from the society here, we gradually try to prove that it is essentially a matter of human that shaping the value through institutions. For example, when the market as a system was created, it only exchanges goods that exclusively owned. And at the same time, the exchange should have actual marginal utility for both parties. So the goods are typical industrial products type, and they have the physical boundaries. And the gradual improvement of the market rules, and I mean the systems of the market for the industrial products further consolidated the individual understanding of the valuable items. So in the end, the products that cannot be recognized by the majority, and they are not inclusively, and there are no physical boundaries, and those goods are gradually excluded from the market, even if they can bring utility to the people. But however, the regulating services, we can see this kind of service or product has no physical boundaries and cannot be exclusively owned. And the marginal utility of these services is almost zero. So people will not exchange them in the market because they are not worth to do so. So in other words, the exchange cannot increase the marginal utility. So why the people exchange? Then we come to the phrase, the realization of the ecosystem products value. Is actually, we should think about the first of all, can ecosystem products realize value through the market? And the second is, suppose the market is one of the potential institutional systems, but what kind of system is the most suitable for the ecosystem products realization? Because under such a specific institutional systems, different values of resources and the ecological environment will be formed. For example, the market system attach great importance to the money value. In contrast, the community culture of a village, they will attach more importance to the existence value. The community culture of the village is different to the market. They are different systems. So this shows what kind of value people prefer is the most crucial factor. This is a core point I want to discuss today. The discussion of this valuing the value of ecological products cannot ignore the values of the related institutional systems. Suppose the value of an institution do not match the common understanding of the value of the ecosystems. I can see the institution is not the right one. So, but I would like to introduce some practice now has been going on, has been moving in the local level of the Chinese government. First, I would like to introduce a value in the so-called the gross ecosystem product accounting. Although there are many other approaches for accounting, such as the SEEA approach, I take this GEP accounting as an example. This accounting refers to the calculation process of the artificially giving the prices of different ecosystem products based on the certain functions and mathematics accounting forms, and then aggregating them into a total value in the monetary form. Normally, it has several steps. The first is to determine the accounting area, to determine the ecosystem type, the location, the distribution, and also they need to list all of the ecological products. And then they come to go back to the office and measure the functional capacities of those ecosystem services, and then apply some market evaluation methods to transform each type of the function, I mean the ecosystem services, into the monetary form. And at last, it finally aggregated into a specific value in currency. So this is a normal step. This is the first one I want to mention, a price or a value in practice. And the second is that some ecosystem products are transferable. As I mentioned earlier, there are two categories of the products. One is the material and then the culture products. And their property rights can be privatized. So there will be a market. We can observe cases in reality. For example, some consumers, they are willing to pay a higher price for the certified or the some famous brand goods than the regular ones. And also there are other example, a German company was producing the medical glassware. They tried to seek a place for its new factory. A local government in Zhejiang province guaranteed a location with a very good ecological environment, and also the water quality, they are matching the needs of the production. So this local government compete with other local government, and finally they succeed. So in the end, the company invest there because they offer, the local government can offer a high quality air and water there. So this example also reflects a kind of marketable value of the ecosystem products. The consumers, they are aware and they are willing to pay the price. So I show this is the second type of the value that emerges in practice. And then the third is there is no market for the regulating services products mentioned above. And in reality, the Chinese government, they often use the cap and treat pattern measures to establish this kind of treat for this type of products. For example, the government has set up a quota for consuming ecosystem products, or they set up a quota for discharging the pollution among different actors. then the actors may decide whether to treat the quarters or not to improve their own, let's say, its own efficiency. For example, Chongqing city in China has a total quota for the forest coverage. It also allows the cross-regional trade among its own district. And the local government in the Qiantang River, I mean the upstream and the downstream of the Qiantang River, they can trade the emission permits allocated by the government. And also we are familiar with the EU ETS, and it is also kind of market. So obviously, the value of the traded quotas, they reflect the value of the regulating services from the ecosystem. I see this is the third type of the value in practice. And fourth, many countries pay the stakeholders and the different kinds of the ecological compensation programs. For example, in the first round of the farmland conversion to the forest project in China, the local farmers will get subsidies every year for a total of 8 years from the government. And the price or the standard, the compensation standard is 20 yuan per mu for managing, and also 210 yuan per mu for subsidy. So this is a kind of governmental pricing, but it is also a price. So this is the fourth type of the value in practice. So let me look at the values in this under these four different institutional contexts. Apparently, suppose these four pricing approaches are used for the same ecosystem products. In that case, the prices will decrease in turn. The first type of the price is accounting price. I mean, normally a researcher, they tend to show the importance of the ecosystem services, so the price will generally be quite higher. And the market generally does not accept the accounting price, but only agree with part of them. So that can be internalized. So the marketable price is usually lower than the accounting price. And the quota price, I mean, under the KPI and trade policies, is based on the redistribution or the redistributing the value added revenue. So therefore, the buyers and the sellers of the quota will share the added value based on the efficiency principle. So as a result, the buyer will offer less price for buying the quota than using its own. The fourth category is the government's fiscal transfer payment. Because this is there is no value added income, it is a pure transfer payment from other budget revenue. And normally due to the limited fiscal budget, the policymakers generally pay lower price than the quota price. So therefore, the prices under the four types of the mechanisms are reduced in a general sense. So this is a kind of analysis, and also we try to use an ABM model to test this. But I'm not going to the detail for the ABM model. And but more importantly, I want to talk about the values behind each system. In this way, I would like to discuss institutional settings for different products value. For the first time, the accounting one, the value is human assessed. Although it has been recognized academically, still there are some challenges. For say, once a matrix and weight are established for the evaluation, it cannot avoid three main problems. The one problem is the cognition and the information problem. That is the assessor or the evaluator. They have difficulties, or they have the cost to observing the services and making the evaluation are different from each other, from person to person. The second is that's the so-called incommensurability. That means the different ecological services are essentially incomparable. So it is actually problematic to use the currency to measure different services. So the third is difficult to decompose the functions of ecosystems. For example, water composition and the soil retention, and they are different functions according to the accounting system. But actually, for the ecological system itself, they are linked to each other. So they cannot be simply regarded as two separated functions. So these three challenges show that the selection of the method to assess will cause some problems. In fact, different methods contain different values. As we all know that the WTA, the willingness to accept and willingness to pay, they imply different values or preferences. And also the evaluator's choice on the approaches will be significantly affected and the different institutional background. If research, they come from institutional settings with a market mechanism, quite pure, quite mature market mechanism. And another research, they come from in a situation or an institutional environment dominated by the community autonomy. I can see the two researchers, they will have different preference to select different methods. Therefore, the accounting, such as the GEP, reflects the evaluator's values for the ecosystems. And for the second time, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you may want to sum up your speech. We are running a little bit out of the schedule.
Okay. Yeah, so I can see for different types of the process, they have different values. For me, I can come to my final sets. So I want to see there should be a spectrum of different values. So on the side is seeking for the monetary value. On the other side is to maintaining the ecosystem systems in an integrative way. But I know that it's quite difficult to have a new value for organizing the valuing ecosystems. So okay, I will come to the final. I would like to quote a saying that from the veteran. I read Beverly, his book. He said like this: if it was possible to buy nothing, if I could buy 50 square feet of nothing, I could secure some space that was free of all this, unless materials they call things. Certainly, if nothing was on the wall, you could see something should be put there. We cannot just leave it. Then I could answer, well, it isn't just left. Nothing is already there. Okay, so, and as he said, I would be happy since at present producing more of these things called nothing would be about the best the system could offer for the future. Okay, so this is what I want to discuss. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Tan, for this really insightful speech. It brings the knowledge on how the value of ecological values is transferred in practice and also reflects to the classic institutional economics. I'm sorry, I have to rush up. That you have to cut some slides due to the time constraints. But thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Professor Beverly Busch and Professor Robert Strauss. Dr. Busch is a professor in the Public Administration Department at the University of Illinois University with a joint appointment in the Center for State Policy and Leadership. She conducts research on state and local government budgeting and financing management. She's associate editor of the Illinois Municipal Policy Journal. Dr. Robert Strauss is a professor of economics and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. He conducts research on public financial policy on issues at federal, state, and local levels. His federal public services experience at the U.S. Treasury and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, U.S. Congress, have been recognized through remarkable awards of presidential pens. And he's an elected fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. They will jointly give you a speech about the evolution of green bonds insurance by U.S. state and local government. We are very much looking forward to your speech. Dr. Busch and Dr. Strauss, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to be a part of this series. Having trouble with my slide. Let me try to stop sharing and try again. Professor Strauss, do you want to pull your slides up? Mine seem to be frozen.
Ooh, okay. That's exciting.
Yeah.
Let me go to the beginning.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can get to the beginning. Okay,
And then go to slideshow at the top.
okay.
Can you push?
Can everybody see? What did you?
Yeah, but click on slideshow at the top. Keep going. Right
Yeah.
there. Yes. And now click all the way to the left from beginning. Good. Click. Did you click?
Yeah, I can see it. Can you see it?
No, we're still on the wrong version.
All right, well, can you?
That's
try
okay.
it?
We'll go from here. So go to
Oh.
the next slide.
Yes. Can you see it, Beverly, or not?
I cannot. I think you must have two screens open.
All right, so,
Try one more time and then we'll go back to mine and see if they'll unfreeze.
is this legible?
Yeah, but click on from beginning on the upper left-hand corner. Yes.
Okay. All right, let's start. You start talking and tell me
Okay. Go ahead to the next slide, please.
when- Okay,
We can't see the next slide.
oh. Well, let's do it just within, without doing full screen.
Okay, the slide
You
before
see-
that. Good. So we're going to start by giving you some background information about our topic, which is green bonds. And then to give you some context, Professor Strauss will give you background on US governments, including the issuance of bonds by US governments. And then we'll focus on our research, talking about our research questions, our approach, and our findings, and close with our conclusions and some future issues. So first of all, what is a bond? A bond is when a government or a company borrows funds and repays the money with interest over time. Green bonds are just a bit different. They're bonds where the proceeds from the borrowing are used to finance projects that have a positive environmental effect. And the bonds are labeled as green bonds. Next slide. Green bonds are issued worldwide, including in China. Cumulative at the end of 2020, $1.1 trillion in green bonds had been issued by over 1,400 issuers in 71 countries. In 2020 alone, 290 billion in bonds were issued that were labeled green. Next slide. This is a graph that shows the regional distribution of green bonds. The blue is Europe, and you can see they account for the largest portion of the volume, but there also is significant issuance in Asia Pacific, the yellowish orange color, and also in North America, the brown color. And you can see the growth that's continued since 2020, moving it through the first 3 quarters of 2021. Next slide. There's various types of projects that have been financed with green bonds. There are renewable energy and energy efficiency projects, as well as green buildings, which are buildings that are designed to be energy efficient or efficient in terms of water. There also is clean transportation, in particularly mass transit, rail lines in urban areas. There's pollution prevention and control, sustainable water and wastewater management, projects designed to adapt to climate change, environmentally friendly products, as well as sustainable land use and biodiversity conservation. Next slide. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Professor Strauss, who'll talk to you a little bit about governments in the United States.
Thank you, Beverly, and thanks very much for the invitation and participation in this very interesting seminar. My goal here is to give you an idea of how we're organized in the United States, and it's very complicated due to our history. We have one national government, and we call it either the federal government or the US government. It has the power to tax, the power to spend, and the authority to issue federal bonds. If there is conflict with each of the 50 sovereign states, if federal laws conflict with the state laws, there's a supremacy clause in the Constitution, and generally federal law trumps. At the national level, we have three co-equal branches of government that are independent: the executive, the Congress, composed of a House and a Senate, and an independent judiciary. And the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court after the federal courts hear conflicts, is the independent national court that ultimately adjudicates or decides on conflict. And our system was designed to have a lot of conflict and have a lot of argument between these three co-equal branches of government. We currently have 50 state governments. Each is co-equal with another, each with their own separate state constitution, with the power to spend, the power to tax. And because they had to get admitted by the national government, the Congress, their structure by and large mirrors that of our national government. That is, they have three co-equal branches with an executive, a House and Senate legislature, a system of state courts, and a state Supreme Court. State governments have the authority to issue debt, and so do their instrumentalities, things like higher education agencies. And most states are limited in the amount of debt they can issue in order to stay in the market. The biggest complexity that we have is that right now we have about 89,000 local governments, and each of them is organized as the constitutional creature of each state government. In terms of geography, each of the 50 states is divided into a county, and the vast majority, each county has the power to tax, to spend, and to issue debt. State constitutions and laws limit local debt. Municipalities and townships are separate from counties, and they can cross county boundaries, and they too have the power to tax, spend, and issue debt. Public education is either provided through politically independent school districts or through school districts which are part of municipal government. Independent school districts, which is the majority in the United States, have the power to tax and spend for education and the power to issue debt. Special districts, or sometimes called public authorities, are established under each of the 50 state laws and can issue debt, but they by and large do not have taxing authority. So they must finance themselves through operating charges and subsidies for the sale of things like water, services, and electricity. Overall, a few years ago, there was 5.4 trillion of total governmental receipts in the United States, 2/3 of which was attributable to the federal government and the remainder to state and local. So state government receipts were 21% and 15%, which is to say that state and local governments are pretty big fiscal actors. When we do a demographic count of the number of local governments over time, as displayed in this graph, you see that the blue line shows the total number of local governments, which was about 159,000 in 1942, and it's kind of gone down to about 89,000 as mentioned before. The big changes are the consolidation in school districts, the red line, which was very dramatic in the 50s and 60s, and then the slow but dramatic increase in the number of public authorities, which have been in charge of functional things like infrastructure, transportation, libraries, and the like, with the power to debt. What about state and local debt today? Well, I'd like to say a little bit about our origins because state and local government got into debt when they were colonies and decided to get free of the British. We were under colonial rule. We had a revolutionary war from 1776 to 83, and we fought for our freedom from Great Britain. We won, but the 13 colonies were severely indebted to support the war effort, as was the national government. Our second constitution of 1787 created a national government, co-equal state governments, as I mentioned, and it's called a federal system because these two layers, the national and the states, are co-equal. In 1790, which is the only time in our history when the national government, up until very recently, did anything systematically, the national government assumed all the states' debts that were related to the Revolutionary War. But in the 1840s, 90s, and the 1930s, when the economy in the US was in depression, we had lots of states actually defaulting. Congress was besieged, but they did not give any assistance to the states to bail them out. State and local government bonds in the United States are tax exempt. And what that means is the national government does not impose the national income tax on the interest income investors receive if those bond interest payments are issued for public purposes. This lowers the cost of borrowing for state and local government to investors, but state and local government debt is less attractive to international investors because it has this lower interest rate. The next slide shows you a sort of a bar chart over time, ending in 2020. And overall, the US debt market was about $50 trillion outstanding, and that includes corporate, federal agency, and the like. And state and local debt was about 7.8%, and that's the yellow bar. And it's been relatively constant over the last 20 odd years. In terms of what the debt is used for, in terms of transportation and water infrastructure, we know in 2017 that state and local governments were responsible for 3/4 of all highway spending, even higher amounts for water utilities, 3/4 for mass transit and rail, a little over half for aviation, about 65% for water resources, and 56% for water transportation. It's important to note that this is the spending, but not the ownership of assets. State and local government, which gets money from the national government through grants, owns the assets that it constructs. So for example, our interstate highway system, financed almost entirely 90% by the national government, is actually owned and maintained by the states. And this is a result of our federal pattern. Okay, so let me turn it back to Beverly.
Okay, now we're going to focus on the research we've been conducting on green bonds. We address 4 major questions. Which state and local governments in the United States are issuing green bonds? Why are those governments issuing green bonds? How are the governments determining which projects are green? And what is the impact of issuing green bonds? Our approach was to gather data primarily through the Climate Bonds Initiative, which is a nonprofit headquartered in London that advocates for the use of green bonds to finance projects that benefit the environment. We also purchased a database from a firm called Merchants that has data on state and local government debt in the US. We reviewed the scholarly literature, also as well as a number of other documents, websites, and news stories. And then we conducted interviews with state and local government officials in governments that have issued green bonds. Most of them, the interviews were fairly early in the process of the green bonds just getting started in 2016, but we've started doing interviews again now. So far, we've interviewed 28 different governments, 6 state governments, 8 local governments, and then the majority of the others were special districts, such as the ones listed there. Next slide. This graph shows the growth of the green bond market for state and local governments. The first issuance was in 2013 by the Commonwealth or state of Massachusetts, and that's grown to 91 different governments in 2019. If you go to the next graph, you can see that the volume also has grown over time, reaching a high of 15 billion in 2020. The next graph shows a map of where the issuers are of green bonds. There are issuers in 37 of our 50 states. And you can see a lot of them are concentrated on the West Coast in the state of California, and also in the Northeast, in particularly in the state of New York. We looked at the data that we purchased to see the projects that are being financed for non-green bonds versus green bonds. Non-green bonds are primarily used for general government, such as roads, and for schools, whereas green bonds were more heavily concentrated in water projects and mass transit, which is basically our urban trains and buses. We asked the people we interviewed why their government decided to issue green bonds, and there were 5 major answers. A few of the larger ones at the early part of the issuance said they viewed their government as a leader. They wanted to be demonstrating to other governments the usefulness of this financing. The 2 most frequent answers we got were number 2 and number 3. It was consistent with their environmental focus. For example, some cities in California are focusing on sustainability, and this is consistent with that. Others said it was a good match for the type of project they were undertaking. If they were replacing water lines to help the environment, they felt they could issue green bonds. And then the other major reasons had to do with finances. They wanted to increase the number of investors to make sure they could borrow funds when they needed them for their capital projects, or it was recommended by their underwriters. And the underwriters are paid consultants that help these governments find investors willing to lend them money. Next slide.
Yeah.
The other question we asked them about is how did they determine which projects are green? And this is complicated because in the US, there's no mandatory standards that have to be followed. And one of the concerns involves a concept called greenwashing, which is when an issuer labels projects as green and they don't really benefit the environment. But we do have voluntary standards and there are independent review options. Next slide. One of the voluntary standards is established by a group called the International Capital Markets Association. And they have developed what's called the Green Bond Principles as listed here. And so state and local governments, when they issue green bonds, can contract for a second party opinion. And that's when an independent review occurs by a firm to certify whether or not the green bond principles have been adhered to. Next slide. Another group is the Climate Bonds Initiative that I mentioned previously. This is a more rigorous review. The projects need to be consistent with lowering greenhouse gas emissions as established in the Paris Treaty. They also adhere to the green bond principles, but they have identified particular types of projects that are considered green in different sectors, such as transportation or water. They also have an external verification program Theirs is called third-party verification. And then the external firm makes a recommendation to the Climate Bonds Initiative Board. And if approved, they are labeled as green with a third-party verification. And this requires more post-issuance reporting, what happens after the bonds are issued. This slide shows an example of reporting. The water district, in this case, the District of Columbia Water, which is in our nation's capital, they report on an annual basis a green report. And in that report, they talk about the removal of pollutants from their waterways. Next slide. We asked the interviewees how they identified green bonds. And in the early parts of the interviews in 2016, very few of the issuers were using any type of independent reviewer. Instead, they were relying on an internal review process. Next slide. More recently, we've looked at 52 official statements, which are documents that describe bonds. And these are green bonds issued in the first half of 2021. And in this case, we see much more use of external reviewers. 25 did self-labeled, i.e. they determined on their own what was green, but the other 27 used either a second party opinion or a third party verification. Next slide. We asked the interviews, what did the governments believe was the impact of issuing green bonds? They liked the public relations. They got good coverage from the media. For the most part, they were able to attract a few new investors who were concerned about the environment. They generally felt there was strong demand for the bonds. They were able to borrow the amounts they intended, but they said there was minimal, if any, impact on interest rates. And this is interesting because there's a thought out there that investors might be willing to take a lower interest return because they also get satisfaction from investing in environmentally worthy projects. So now I'll turn it back to Professor Strauss, who will share with you our empirical analysis of the impact of green bonds on interest rates.
So we have access to the Emergent Russell Municipal Bond Database from the period 1990 to 2019. So we can train the model explaining yield to maturity across 3.3 million green and non-green bonds. Remember that green bonds started in 2013. And so the research question that we're asking is, with multiple regression analysis, are green bonds borrowing costs less, more, or the same as non-green bonds in the US? And this gets back to earlier comments made about whether people are altruistic and willing to take a lower rate of return. There is a little bit of literature, and Baker found the after-tax yield on green bonds 5 to 7 basis points lower than non-green bonds. That was in 2018. Larker and Watts didn't find any difference. But what we find is actually a significant 16 basis points lower yield for green bonds. And the mechanism is that bonds, when they're offered, are typically at, say, at a coupon of 5%. And if there is this shift in demand, it drives up the price and lowers the rate of return. And so we estimated across the 3.3 million observations, a regression model with explanatory variables of maturity, which, because of risk and more the length, the duration of a bond going up, raises the return to investors, whether the bond was insured or not, which is a common phenomenon, part of our history period, whether the bond was callable or not, whether a sinking fund was required, whether it was a revenue bond, and whether it was competitively or sold through private placement, and also year and month dummies. And then finally, 0-1 variable, 1-0 really, for whether the bond was green or not. And so what we found was this 16 basis point lower yield to maturity for green bonds And over the period of analysis, that turns out to be about a 0.04 or 4% lower, relatively lower rate of return for green bonds and a T ratio of like about 150. So it's a significant phenomenon. Beverly will now summarize our findings.
Yeah, I see we're running short on time. Let me just highlight a few things. The green bonds is a growing market. We've seen an increased use in independent reviewers, and the verdict's still out whether there'll be lower interest rates. Some of the issues that we think should be looked at in the future is, are the projects truly green? Will they continue to be green over time? How will the environment be helped as a result of these projects? And will green bonds eventually result in new projects being undertaken that otherwise would not have occurred? And then looking at the life cycle of the projects, will green bonds demonstrate net benefits to the environment? And then lastly, on next slide, please, we look at whether or not the market will continue to evolve, whether there'll be increased reporting both before and after the bond issue, whether there'll be expanded use of performance metrics, will there be a movement towards increased development and acceptance of international standards, and will there be an increase in use of independent reviewers? So thank you so much for allowing us to present tonight. And if you want to be in touch with us, here is our contact information.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bunch and Dr. Strauss. Well, actually, this morning, our speakers are showing us the big efforts our government and society are making to make our planet green through different governance structures, fiscal transfer, market solution, or green bonds. While there might exist a problem, like Professor Bunch and Professor Strauss just say, how can we make sure that these projects are green? How can we make sure that they will keep going on green? And now I think for this question, we have an excellent discussant. I can't wait to invite our discussant, Dr. Wu Yang. He's a junior professor from the College of Environmental and Resource Science, Zhejiang University. He has a multiple discipline background with ecological economics and sustainability science. He's specializing in developing qualitative metrics of ecosystem service and constructing system models to measure ecosystem service and to understand the causal mechanism of how policy interventions affect ecosystem service. So Dr. Yang, please.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lu Yu. And actually, it's also glad to see some other friends, John, Busch. Yeah, I'm sorry to miss your speech because I just finished the students' final exam, but I catch it up with two other talks. I think it's very interesting talks, and all of those talks are focusing on those actually economical and ecological and economical dimensions. So for the conservation policies, and also including those actually energy policies and other actually green policies. I think actually not just in China, but outside of China, we have been paying more and more attention about the outcomes of those government green policies. Some in China, we call it ecological compensation policies, or sometimes we call it ecological transfers. And also I missed John's talk, but I indeed actually read your global review of the ecological fiscal transfers article in Nature Sustainability. So I know what exactly you are talking. But actually in China, we have been doing actually many of those we call the impact evaluation about actually those ecological transfer projects, or sometimes in the global literature, we call it payments for ecosystem service programs. But actually we did a review dating back to 2018 among 7,299 actually articles published actually related to Chinese actually PS program. only 105 actually are quantitative, and among them, only 27, if I remember correctly, 27 actually used the experiment design or the quasi-experiment design. Most of those studies are either qualitative or semi-quantitative. So actually, I'm happy to say that actually the next talk trying to actually talk about some of the quantitative outcomes of the green bonds policies in US. Maybe actually we should pay more attention to like those climate change policies, and also some, especially for those actually renewable energy actually policies. I think they're combined with the land policies. It has dramatic actually not only environmental outcomes but also social, ecological actually outcomes on those local communities. Also actually for those companies. But so far, those actually I think the systematic design and the quantitative studies are really actually missing in the literature. Often a few, but actually in most cases, people are still, some of them probably due to lack of data. Some of them only focus on one dimension. For example, the ecologists only focus on the ecological side, and the economists actually may only actually focus on the economic side. So I would say it's crucially actually important to take a interdisciplinary actually perspective to conduct actually integrated impact evaluation. I think actually John has been an expert, actually have been doing such kind of research, but actually in some other discipline, like actually I've seen like in the Journal of Clean Production or in the Journal for RCR, Recycling and Conservation and Reuse. Many of those journals, and I think it's still negative on those quantitative results. So I would say actually it's interesting to say that actually we are paying more and more attention to such kind of design, and also those sophisticated actually quantitative studies. So that's something I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yan, for the insightful comments. It shows us how transdisciplinary communication could opens up possibilities for dealing with environmental issues. Would our speakers like to respond to the comments briefly? Well, actually, we are running out of the schedule. So I guess we don't have much more time for discussion. But I believe our audience have found today's talk inspiring and insightful. I do wish that this dialogue continue, can have more time to discuss. But I believe this is not the end of the communication. We will have more dialogues on the way. I think the next dialogue will be held in coming weeks. So if you are interested in any more communications or our dialogues, please follow us on WeChat or Facebook. We will keep you updated about the coming events. In the end, I want to take this opportunity to thank you all again for joining today's event. Special thanks to our distinguished speakers and discussant, to our audience, and also to Hanjing and Shilei for helping organizing this event. Okay, have a nice day and a nice evening. Bye-bye. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.